How you guys going? I mean, Laura, really? I mean,
Yeah,
we could just go back home.
How
it's
far
fine.
can we push this?
I don't know.
People are hungover.
Guys, how you going?
Oh, that was
All right, awesome. I'll take that. My name is Marc Fennell. Welcome to the very first SBS VICELAND forum here at Splendour on the Grass. Give yourselves a round of applause for being here at midday.
Thank you, guys.
My name, as I mentioned, is Marc Fennell, alongside also from SBS VICELAND, this fine woman here, Laura Murphy-Oats. Introduce yourself, Laura.
Hello, I'm Laura Murphy-Oats. I'm a Nyampa Whale-One woman and a journalist. Hello.
Now, this is a forum all about being young and Indigenous in Australia. The hashtag, should you wish to join in the conversation, is young and black. Laura, tell me a little bit about, we're going to be talking about race, pride, getting laid, a variety of things today. If it were up to me, we'd just do the whole thing about getting laid. No, I'm kidding, not really. What sorts of things are we talking about today?
We're going to talk about many things. Before we go into that, though, we do need to acknowledge the land that we are meeting on today. I just want to acknowledge that we're standing on Bundjalung land, and today to welcome us to his country, we have Splendour's own songman, Uncle Magpie, here. Uncle Magpie, can you welcome everyone welcome to the stage?
Tinggal awal-awal na nganyanyari gurulbu ngayo bunon kano ngayo yukombe menyang bal yuwe. My name is Magpie. I come from Bununga. Bununga is what we call Fingal Heads today. Now, my father was born there. I grew up there, and from generation to generation, times have changed. My father's obviously grown up in a different time from me. So I tell a different story, I guess. But for a long time in this country, what we do, the traditional way to welcome people in our country, is to give them a song and a blessing. So this is a welcome song. This is called Wallo Wallo. That just means you. Wala na guwe Changawa malya Bundjalung Pamgini nganya jamala he demanda nalena Jahengene wonganya bane guwe Wala na guwe Changawa malya Bundjalung I'm getting a yamala head, the manana lena. Yangene wong on your bunny, egu. Thank you and welcome.
Thank you very much, Uncle Magpie. Okay. Thanks, Uncle Magpie. Now, we'll give you a little bit of background today about what we're going to talk about. Last year, we did make a documentary called Young and Black, featuring none other than the lovely Geoffery Winters and several other young Indigenous people from around the country. In it, we talked about both the brilliance and the bullshit that comes with being an Indigenous millennial today. It's fair to say that Indigenous people in this country still face a lot of injustice. And before we actually talk or go into this forum, I want to talk about something that's been in the news for the past 24 hours. You might remember last year, a 14-year-old boy was killed when he was run over by a car in Kalgoorlie in Western Australia. Yesterday, the man who was driving that car was given a 3-year sentence, and he avoided charges of manslaughter. Indigenous people around the country today feel a great sense of injustice. They feel that justice has not been done in this case. And unfortunately, that is part of what it can mean to be young and black in this country today. So I just wanted to, as part of, the discussion, or before we actually get into discussion, to pay my respects to Elijah Doherty's family and all the families that are hurting in Kalgoorlie today. But we have a lot more to talk about today.
Shall we introduce our panel?
We should introduce our panel.
All right. Some of you will know him from his fabulous TV show, Hunter Page-Lochard. Welcome. Hunter is a Mununjali and Nunakal man, correct? We've also got Jacinta Nampijinpa Price.
Nampijinpa.
Okay. You're an Alice Springs councillor, you're a music TV presenter, you're a Walpurgis Celtic woman. And our special guest from Canada, we have the star of SBS VICELAND show Rise, Sarain Carson Fox. Welcome. Sarain is Anishinaabe from Northern Ontario, and Geoffery Winters is a former Liberal candidate for, you would say, seat of Sydney? Yep, in the last election, and you're Gamilaroi as well?
Correct.
Excellent. All right, so in all the different topics that we're going to cover today, there's been one thing that, particularly in this environment at a music festival, one issue that seems to have come up pretty massively in the last year and will probably come up again around about January 26th next year. Do you think, Geoffery Winters, we should change the date of Australia Day?
No. I didn't arrive at that conclusion automatically. My view is this. I think history is complicated, and most occasions we celebrate significant dates on are filled with both wonderful things and very sad things. And I think it would be weak and simple as a country if we moved Australia Day. What I think we should do is embrace complexity and a troubled past that, much like Anzac Day, for example, which is notionally a sad and commemorative occasion, I think we should spend part of Australia Day reflecting on our history, all parts of it, good and bad, and then we should go to the pub and get pissed. So I think this idea that it's disrespectful is true. Currently, in the way it's celebrated, it is disrespectful. It ignores a huge and significant part of our history, which is factually agreed upon by most people. And I think what we should do as a smart and sophisticated modern society is fold in that complication and spend more time each year on Australia Day thinking about where we are now, how we got there, the good, the bad, and the ugly.
Hunter, you've described Australia Day as having a barbecue on the funeral of your grandmother. Do you think we should move Australia Day?
Oh, look, I agree with what Geoffrey's saying, and then, you know, I don't agree as well. And I guess it's and the reason why I don't agree, I guess, is kind of what you just said as well. You know, it's something that we should embrace, you know, the good and the bad side of it. And, you know, that's actually a new insight that I've kind of heard about it, really. And he's kind of made me rethink that barbecue phrasing that I said.
But we agreed to disagree on this panel,
we agreed to disagree.
So you're going to have to go
we
against
agreed
me.
to disagree. But you know, I'm a big advocate of, you know, we got to put in the groundwork to actually try and have positive approaches to things. And you know, I feel if we change the date, we shouldn't do it in a way where it's in spite because we're angry or negative towards something already, and it already being on that day, and we need to change it because, like, aggressively, I guess.
So we need to bring the country with us, kind of.
Yeah, exactly. So then everyone's kind of a part of it and rejoices in it.
Sarain, this isn't just an issue that's unique to Australia. Just recently you had Canada Day, or Canada 150. How do the Indigenous people of Canada feel about that day? Because it symbolises, in many ways, very similar sort of issues.
You know, we did just celebrate Canada 150, and I chose not to participate in those celebrations at all, because for me that's a celebration of 150 years of genocide, and I don't believe in celebrating genocide. Here's the flip side of that, though. Had the celebrations been done differently, had we been a part of the narrative, had we been allowed to control the backstory, then I absolutely would have been proud to be a part of that day. So that's why it's so important to think about the policy, think about the messaging, and think about the tools that we're using, and not just what we're celebrating, but who has something to celebrate. So my stance was, we don't have very much to celebrate in Canada right now as Indigenous people. So when everyone else was waving flags and celebrating fireworks, well, I'm really happy for them that they have good things to celebrate. I want people to have good things, but I want to be a part of that too.
And the thing on that, I think, you know, in Australia Day, we are seeing more of an inclusion of Indigenous artists and Indigenous speakers into Australia Day events. But that's not changing the message. That's not changing the thing that we are, celebration, the fact that it is a celebration. You know, having Jess Malboy come up and sing the national anthem on Australia Day does not mean that that is a day that is inclusive of Aboriginal people.
Does that mean Jess shouldn't have agreed to it?
I believe in Jess's right to perform on whatever day she chooses. She's her own person, she has her own politics.
Can I just add to that really quickly? I think it's really important. I don't know if this happens here, but because there's funding for Indigenous people and because this idea of inclusion means you just put an Indigenous person on stage and call it inclusion, there's a lot of Indigenous people who just show up, and then they're just the token native on stage because there's funding to do a whole show that has to have that. So it can't be the afterthought.
Actually, have at least 5 Indigenous people on stage.
I want to bring Jacinta in here, because when you hear the debate around changing the date, what goes through your head? Because you're not necessarily the biggest fan of this whole campaign, are you?
No, I have to agree with Geoffery. I think there are far more important issues to address, like the fact that our women are dropping dead like flies because of family violence. And so something like changing the date of Australia Day to me is a bit more trivial, I guess. And for me, I consider myself a product of reconciliation. I've got a Warlpiri mother and a white Australian father, and I've grown up in love. I've grown up in that love. There in the Northern Territory, there's not been the level of racism that I think probably exists more on the East Coast than in the Northern Territory. So for me, it is a day that I do celebrate what this country has given me, my background. My children not only have Warlpiri, Irish, Scottish, Welsh, but Mauritian, French, Creole, Malay, Indian, Scandinavian. And to me, I think we're a young country, but we're created from the rest of the world. We've come from the rest of the world, and so it's a celebration of everyone for me. And my Warlpiri grandfather, I've come to learn recently, was shackled in chains and marched from his country to another part of Central Australia. He went through incredible change in his lifetime, but to him it was like those were hard times, and as human beings, life was really bloody tough back then. But he didn't, hold the government responsible for that, or white Australians in general responsible for that. He knew the individuals themselves, and it was about holding them responsible. And he, in my view, seeing all of that and then absolutely loving my white father and seeing my white father as a symbol of understanding what the future is, and knowing that his daughter had the opportunity to learn of the modern world and really embracing that. I think my grandfather was a visionary in that aspect, because he didn't see white people till he was in his early adolescence. And so I've learned a lot from him in the way he's moved forward, and the way that he recognises that human beings are capable of horrible things and really wonderful things. And I don't think changing the date is going to change our history. I think we absolutely need to recognise our history and have a moment of remembrance, perhaps earlier in the day, and then look toward, again, our future. What does our future look like? And we do have a wonderful country in comparison to countries in other parts of the world. We have the world's oldest living culture. We have contemporary Western culture living harmoniously, and where other countries are ethnically the same, but the religious differences are causing them to kill each other. We have a lot to celebrate.
Do you believe that the way that Australia Day is celebrated right now, though, is the right way?
Well, there's so many different ways of celebrating it.
Yeah.
So many different people.
Yeah, but when you turn on the news, there's one story, and the same story is the same every year, though, and it looks the same and it doesn't change.
I think if you allow yourself to live a Channel 7 lifestyle, then that's
Hashtag Channel 7 lifestyle. I don't know what it is, but it sounds glorious.
That's going to be you choose the narrative that you listen to. Yeah. And the two words that have been repeated in this discussion so far are narrative and inclusion. The narrative isn't comprehensive yet, and so that's the task for us. The second part is inclusion, and Jacinta taps on this just so beautifully. All of us have mixed backgrounds. Yes, like Jacinta, I have a parent who was born on a reserve and didn't see a white person until he was 10. But equally, I have a grandmother that was born in Chelsea in London. I don't back the English come the ashes, but as an Aussie with that complicated background, my Australia Day should be complicated also. Because everybody in this room, whether you're Australian or not, where you come from, because of the integrated world we live in, has a complicated background. The nation's background is complicated also. Let's just get on with understanding, talking about it, embracing, reflecting, and celebrating the good part. Because I think it's so easy to just move the date. I actually think it's a simple victory for the mainstream society. Yeah, these black guys are whinging about something, sure, we'll move a date. There's no discussion about a young kid being killed and the police not prosecuting the case and him being convicted. when that gets moved. There's no domestic violence discussion. It's just an easy ticker box. We've told them to shut up. We've done what they wanted. Whereas if we keep it on the day, there's an opportunity for us each year, at least once as a nation, to spend some time thinking and reflecting about the complexity and difficulties it means to be a 21st century society.
So how do you change that? How do you move that day so it becomes that?
That's just knowledge, though, isn't it? That's just providing the right type of knowledge so people don't live that Channel 7 lifestyle.
That's absolutely.
I love that that's becoming a recurring thing, by the way. So great.
It's both that, but also think about this. I don't know if this is the observation others make as well, but 10 years ago, most public occasions weren't opened with a welcome to country. Most government processes, large public gatherings, music festivals, now embrace that component of the celebration. I'm an impatient person, and so I hate that this is probably the answer, but the answer is it's going to take time. I think we're starting to get there, but I think within our lifetime we will see Australia leading the way again, quietly and very self-deprecatingly, as a country that starts to understand itself.
Geoffery, do you think of yourself as an activist within the Liberal Party, changing things from within?
Yeah, of course. You can't be a gay Aboriginal man who works as a native title lawyer and sit in the same party as, well, you can start the list of names. But at the
Just yell out names, guys. Go for it. I'm kidding.
At the end of the day, you've got two choices if you want to get involved in politics. You can be the crossbench activist, which is an excellent way for people to spend their time. I have no problem with people making that choice. But for me, our country is run by two parties that form government every 3 or 4 years. And there's a table of 10 men and women that get around every Friday or Tuesday occasionally and actually set the policy agenda. Now, you can sit on the crossbench and hold them hostage every 3 weeks when it comes through the Senate, or you can be at that table. And I've chosen to try to get to that table one day, being the cabinet table. People talk about quotas and whether we should be having the national voice, and I know we're going to talk about that in a minute. I think the greatest form of political activism by Aboriginal people is getting inside the major parties and getting a seat on the front bench. We've currently got the first Indigenous front bench minister in Ken Wyatt. I have no doubt that when we change governments, we'll see 2 ministers in the form of Linda Burney and Senator Dodson. If that's not practical, constructive reconciliation occurring through individual volition, then I don't know what is. And it's a huge success and we don't celebrate it enough.
Can we talk a little bit? Actually, no, you want to jump in.
I just wanted to say, in terms of moving forward, I also feel strongly that as Aboriginal people, we need to embrace forgiveness. We've had sorry, and the healing cannot begin for anyone until the act of forgiveness is that step's been taken as well. And again, you know, I mean, I look back at sorry and I think it's, you know, wonderful that it made people feel better, but once again, it didn't save a single life. The lives that, you know, I see every day in the town camps around Alice Springs, there were no lives saved as a result, just like there aren't going to be any lives saved for changing the date. But to be able to heal, that comes from within. You can't expect someone else to heal you. So that step of forgiveness needs to be taken as well, so we can all move together.
Is there value in public symbolism, though? Does it change? Does it help change live on the ground, or is it really something that lazy Eastern Coasters do?
Not from where I come from. Not from where I come from.
I'm going to interject on that, to be honest.
You want both.
Laura?
Yeah, I think it definitely has some worth. You know, I have been covering Australia Day or Invasion Day or Survival Day, whatever you would like to call it, but NITV officially had a stance a few years ago that we're calling it Survival Day. And I covered it for SBS World News this year, and I've covered it in the past as well for NITV. And for the very first time, I went to these protests that we have every year, where it's just the Indigenous community turning up, maybe a couple of, you know, far left activists as well, as they do. And this year I turned up, and the cross section of people that actually came and gave a shit, because Change the Date is accessible. I have my own feelings about Change the Date being this easy narrative that the wider society can jump onto, and, you know, doesn't cost them anything. It's not, you know, trying to bring down the incarceration rates. It's not saving lives. But turning up to that protest this year and seeing the cross-section of society, seeing mates from university who I didn't think gave a shit about politics. They actually came and they marched with the Aboriginal community of Sydney in their hundreds, thousands, for the first time. That is a massive change. If you can get people, if you can get a foot in the door in terms of Indigenous politics through Change to Date, and they start giving a shit about other issues that are more important, that makes change, and that's how you make change.
And I think the fact we're having this discussion shows the merit of, well, the value of the Change the Date campaign, because it means we are starting to talk about these issues.
It's a lightning rod.
In a concentrated way. But as we'll get onto when we talk about constitutional recognition, the first, and you ask how we move things, most people will want to know, well, what's it look like? That's the one question whenever you propose massive change to a society. Everyone wants to know what's going to look like. Well, you know, I'm lucky to live in an inner city environment which is extremely inclusive. But my Australia Day this year involved getting up, going with my dad and my mum, black and white, down to the park out the front of Sydney Uni where there's a huge cultural festival going on. Language being spoken, dancing, everyone's together. Then we went to a big lunch, then we went to the pub. It's very straightforward. This is one of the easiest ones. It's just about getting the building blocks together and showing people that this isn't frightening, this isn't threatening, it's not going to lead to some massive undoing of an excellent society we've delicately woven.
Just want to add one real quick thing, because I think there is power in information, and I think the way that we interact with policy, with government, I think it does actually inform how the public sees us. Of course, we know that. And so on the topic of saving lives, you know, for Indigenous women back home where I am, there's thousands of murdered and missing Indigenous women that aren't being, their cases aren't being prosecuted, they're actually just not being looked for, and so we've just had an inquiry started now. But the over-sexualized, romanticized imagery of Indigenous women that is okay in the media has a part to play in that. So when we change the way that we allow the public to talk about us, there actually is the potential to save lives, because when Indigenous people matter in the media, when Indigenous women are being talked about as strong, powerful, capable women, then the rape and killing and murders of these women become valuable to investigate and to figure out. And I know that's a backwards thing to say, but we can't have allies and we can't have support and we can't get people on our side unless we can change the entire narrative of how we're being looked at. You know, Pocahontas is a great example of how Indigenous women in North America have been played. You know, she didn't go back with John Smith and live a great life. She went back and died of smallpox. Why is that not in the movie?
But see, this stuff's occurring slowly. I think you're right about the narrative. And part of the problem has been for too long we've allowed the Indigenous narrative to be poor, uneducated and rough. And slowly we're taking hold of that through things like, shameless plug, Hunter's Show, where you see strong Aboriginal figures who are the hero. You see language being spoken, and not in some tokenistic, now some Aboriginal language kind of way. It's weaved into a narrative in a beautifully creative way. That, coupled with strong leadership and activism, which is entirely part of the cocktail, that's how you change things. And that's how you take over the narrative, and that's how you put it in front of people and make it okay.
And you're right, it has to involve patience as well, because it does take time, which can frustrate a lot of people too, I guess.
Sarain, there's a move on in Australia to have a treaty between our Indigenous peoples and the government. It's long and complicated, but there's been treaties in place in Canada for hundreds of years. How's that working out?
Well, I mean, treaties only work if people on both sides are willing to keep their promises, and almost every single treaty that has ever been signed in Canada and the United States has been broken. And that's not an exaggeration.
Why have they been broken? What happened?
Because Indigenous people sit on some of the richest land for resource extraction, and we get in the way of so-called progress. So treaties get broken every time you want to, you know, open a mine or build a mall, or our sacred burial sites might get in the way of some big highway that's coming through. Because our sacred sites aren't the Vatican. They don't have monuments. It could be a tree that your grandmother has gone to for thousands of years. And if that tree is just a tree, well then sure. It's in the way, but you know, for us it's sacred. And so the other thing about treaties is that we're not seen as being capable enough to be involved in the conversation with government. And so if we're not in that conversation, then we can't make it work.
Jacinta, when you hear conversations about reconciliation and treaty, what goes through your head when you're on the ground?
Confusion. No. I guess in terms of treaties, I mean, again, my focus is really just on trying to save lives. They're the tough issues, and I think regardless of whether there are treaties or not, that's just an ongoing thing and an immediate concern for me. And with regard to treaties, I wonder how that is going to be played out. You know, does every single language group have a treaty? And, you know, who do we...
600 different languages.
Yeah,
language groups.
that's a lot of treaties.
It's a lot of work for us lawyers.
That's a lot of bureaucracy, you know, like we've got enough bureaucracy in our country as it is almost. You know, but I don't mind.
Okay.
You know?
Well, Geoffery, you're involved in the gradual move towards one of these outcomes. When you hear stories like Sarain's, does it give you pause about how best to move forward?
Yeah, it does. I think what I found really surprising, obviously you're from Canada, but when I was in the United States last year, you go to the National Museum of the Native American there, that across the US, New York State is a classic example. There were treaties signed when the frontier settlers went through, and of course, they've successively been broken. One of the things we have in this country already, and we don't talk about it, and perhaps that's why it's so successful, is we have a set of cultural heritage protection laws and the Native Title Act, which are some of the most, if you're a minerals company, you'd probably say draconian restrictions, that what you're talking about, Sarain, can't take place. As a native title lawyer, I often act for groups who have an interest in a land where there is a commercial activity about to take place, and the Adani Carmichael Mine's a classic example, the group which my firm acted for the native title holders. The commercial interest is effectively bent over a table to the will of the Indigenous landholder, and it's enforced stringently. Yes, the group gets to make a decision, and sometimes they make decisions the rest of us disagree with, but at the end of the day, they get to have a say and approve what takes place on their land. The discussion about treaty, I think, is somewhat misplaced in this country. There's an interesting Canadian academic who says Australia probably already has a treaty, we just don't know it. Because when you think about a treaty in the historical legal terms, what you're talking about is an agreement of language, history, and legal rights between our cultural protections, the Native Title Act, and in fact, most people forget, every state in this country has a clause at the start of its written constitution which recognises their state is traditionally Aboriginal land. When you put those things together, you effectively have a treaty in substance. Do I think there's huge power, and Laura's about to attack me on this, do I think there's huge power in going through the process as a country? Of course there is. But at the end of the day, we've probably got the elements of a treaty already, and I think it's time that we turned our attention to the lives that are currently being lost.
I just want to pull you up on some of those points that you just made, because native title, you're talking about having a seat at the table and how that's a strength. But same as when you have a treaty, if you're an Aboriginal group and you don't know how the system works, you don't know the law, you are disadvantaged in those negotiations. And I've reported on cases where Indigenous people don't really understand those negotiations taking place. Yeah. And I would not say that native title law is, protecting the rights of all Aboriginal people.
I think any person who's ever had an interaction with the law, be they white or black, knows that without knowing the law that you're currently facing, it's difficult. So I think that your point's legitimate, but it's just a societal observation. Any person who interacts with the law and isn't a lawyer is at a disadvantage. When a group of native title holders have good legal representation, they're in a good position. But your point is right, too often they don't. It's an extremely complicated process. Inevitably, the other side will have millions of dollars of legal resources behind them. So it's always a David and Goliath situation. So yes, that's true, but I don't think that's an observation that can be got around in any way. Unfortunately, the second you get it right in law, you need a lawyer. It's the difficulty.
So in that way, that does kind of weaken that strength, that the combination of all of these different laws that are for Aboriginal people, constitutes a treaty, possibly.
No, it does do that, but it also reinforces Jacinta's point, which is this. Why do you want a treaty? So more lawyers can haggle over the language, so we can spend millions of dollars going through a process of deciding who gets what and who doesn't, and at the end of the day, the Parliament can still override it.
What about the treaty in New Zealand? That has led to some real outcomes. There are set-aside places in Parliament. They have strong fishing rights. They have strong land rights.
We have strong fishing rights and strong land rights in this country too, and your point that you're making is it's difficult to assert them, and I don't disagree with that. The point is, a treaty is an opportunity to reset the relationship between two groups, or multiple groups. That's the value of the current treaty we're talking about in this country, the opportunity to reset it. Most of the other elements I genuinely hold out, I think and agree, do exist. and it's about trying to understand them and giving people access to them.
And when I hear people in, been going to treaty forums around the country, and that is what people are saying, that they just want power in this negotiation, and they want power in this relationship. They don't actually fully understand how a treaty would work, but they know that that is something that, as Aboriginal people, gives you something, in these negotiations.
Laura, can I ask, what is your preferred layout?
Of how the country would run with the treaty?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I ask in the sense because we've heard a really bad example of how it works in Canada, and there's a really good example of how it works in New Zealand. Are there elements that you would cherry pick from other countries that you would put in place here?
It's hard. I mean, New Zealand does have some admirable elements. They've got set-aside places in Parliament. How a treaty would work in Australia, it's very hard because I can only speak for, my people, and that's part of the issue because we have hundreds and hundreds of nations. Do we do a treaty between each nation? Do we do as we're doing in Victoria, where a state is now negotiating and committed to negotiate on a treaty with its peoples?
So is the Northern Territory as well, which is interesting.
So, to be honest, my treaty is just something that gives people self-governance, that gives people power and negotiation with corporations and with government.
And see, this is the point. We've called it treaty, but really what we're talking about is the Aboriginal community has a sense that something was taken from them, and that is now sitting with another group of people, and it's power, and they want some of it back. Not all of it, just a bit of it, and that's the symbolic recognition component. And until the mainstream political class realises that that's what the conversation actually is about, it's just about power, and starts to figure out, all right, well, what are we willing to give up and where are we going to bring these people in?
Power and symbolism are obviously very important, but there's also some practical things. It's nearly 10 years since the apology for the stolen generations, and still today you are 10 times more likely to be taken away from your family as a kid if you're Indigenous. I've heard you describe this as something of a second stolen generation. Are you comfortable with that term?
Sorry, say it again?
I've heard you describe it as a second stolen generation. Are you comfortable with that term?
In New South Wales in the last 5 years, the rate of Aboriginal children under the age of 16 being taken into government custody has almost quadrupled. And it was already a high stat. So it's remarkable. Because we're so sensitive about language such as stolen generation, we don't label these things anymore, and I don't think we need to. Let's just look at the numbers. It's remarkable, and it's troubling, and it's everyone's problem.
No, you go.
I don't think a treaty is going to solve that situation, but as Laura was pointing out before, I don't think there's anything wrong, and I think there's a lot of symbolic spiritual goodness to come from that process, but we've got to get back to figuring out what the answer is.
Jacinta, 65% of those kids end up not in an Indigenous family. Is that failing the system?
In the Northern Territory.
In the Northern Territory specifically.
In the Northern Territory, I don't think it's failing. I think what comes first and foremost is a child's life and the opportunity to have what every other Australian kid has, regardless of, that child's background. What I know is that my people who have their language and their culture and they live by customary law still intact, they are the most marginalised people in this country. And one thing that I talk often about is the need for cultural reform for my people, and I'm talking about my people in the Northern Territory who have that, because we're still living by laws that governed us thousands of years ago that don't work nowadays, and this is why I believe there is such high rates of family violence, and this is why also children's, the neglect of children is happening, and they need, why it's being reported so often, and why we're seeing high numbers of kids being removed. In Alice Springs, you can walk around at the moment, 2 o'clock in the morning, you will see an 8-year-olds on the streets. It's critical right now. There's a crisis going on, and these kids need love, and they need homes, and they need opportunities. I have members of my family who are being brought up in white families across the country, and these kids are absolutely shining. They have got opportunity. They've got life in their eyes. They are smiling with their eyes, and this is all that we want for our kids, because there's a critical situation going on in the Northern Territory. And you have small communities, so if there's dysfunction in this family, to get shifted to another one close by, that dysfunction still exists in that community. Often those kids have to go elsewhere, and we are seeing a lot of kids who are now, there are schools in Melbourne and Sydney who are looking after children from the Northern Territory, boarding schools, and giving them the opportunities that other kids in this country take for granted. And again, it's just basic. It's about saving these children's lives, you know, regardless of what their backgrounds are.
Sarain?
I just want to jump in because I can't speak to the situation here, but what I can speak to is the situation back home, and we had very, very similar backgrounds. You call it stolen generation, we call it the 60s scoop, where children were taken from their families and put up for adoption and given to white families all over the world. There are even many of them who ended up in Australia, and that has never stopped. There are more kids in care right now than were ever in the residential school system, which is the mission school system that you guys have here. So it has never stopped. It's changed its name. And I don't think that the answer is to put an Indigenous kid in a white family, because for two reasons. One, the reason that our communities are so messed up is because our children, our culture, our land, our ability to care for our own was taken away. So how do you fix the solution? Like, how do you make a solution by causing the same kind of harm over and over and over again? There are things that Aboriginal Indigenous families can offer to children that no non-Indigenous family could ever offer them, because it speaks to spirit. So we're talking about basic human rights, access to, you know, essentials of life. That's really important. But those things are really important. I think for me as an Indigenous person, if I were raised with all of the necessities of life without my culture, I would have been a great human, but I would be very, very lost, because eventually I would start seeking out who I am, and all of the answers to who I am would not be available to me. And so then we're solving the problem from the backwards end. So then they get all of the help that they need as a child, but then as an adult, they have to go searching for who they are again. So the solution is, let's find a way to heal our communities so that we can take care of our children in a good way.
And I agree with that notion. We do need to heal our communities, but not at the cost of these children's lives. When you've got 3-year-olds with syphilis, it's not good enough to say, okay, just stay in that situation so you know who you are when you grow up and you end up locked up. But yeah, if you grow up and you're a whole rounded individual with all the things that you need from the foundations, you've got a better chance of finding out who you are than if you're a 3-year-old with syphilis in a dire situation.
It just sounds like a little bit of an intergenerationalized racism.
No, it's not racism at all. This is what is going on in remote communities in Central Australia. I've got a niece and a nephew who are currently who have a lot of contact with family, who are in a foster situation with a white family. We have a situation now where there's suddenly an auntie has come out of the woodwork and wants to take them. And I know a lot of people who actually take the kids only because they get a payment because of it. And these are the things we have to address. These are really horrible issues, but we've got to be honest about them, and we've got to address them if we want to see these kids' lives change.
Now, I want to butt in here. When you're talking about kids who have been abused, definitely, they need to not be in harm's way, ever. But one of the things that's come out of the NT Royal Commission, which was looking into children in care, is other cases where, you know, we had people working in family and children's services or former workers coming up to the NT Royal Commission and talking about how poverty was being confused with neglect, and that kids were being removed because of the effects of intergenerational trauma, because of the poverty that Indigenous people are living in the Northern Territory. So to say that, you know, it's okay that 65% of kids that are removed in the Northern Territory are placed with white families, like, when it's a situation where it isn't a life-threatening situation, where poverty is being confused with neglect, and then there's all these other options. There's options within families and communities, and kids are going to white families instead. I've seen the impact that can have in my own family. I've seen it in my dad. I've been to, you know, family reunions or family gatherings where 8 or 9 great aunties and uncles in their 80s and 90s are meeting for the first time. They've never met each other. They've never met their family. And they don't know who they are. And that leads to severe kind of mental, psychological trauma and stress. So in terms of abuse, yes, I'm not going to say that I'm an expert in how to deal with that in the family and children's services.
Absolutely. I think the system itself needs a whole shake-up. It needs to be better sorted out. So those kids that shouldn't be removed, but the kids that do need to be removed should be removed, because there's circumstances where often kids aren't being removed when they should be. Recently, I had my my niece's children were being brought up in Newcastle with my white cousin. Their mother was murdered in a town camp. She was stabbed to death and drowned in her own blood in a town camp. 2 weeks ago, one of those young fellas, he'd moved back because he couldn't handle being in Newcastle anymore, but his brother stayed there. He'd moved back. He's now 17, and he witnessed his mother's sister being beaten completely. She died that following night. This was 2 weeks ago. So he went back to go and be with his family and be part of his culture, which is actually dysfunctional right now and is not good for him. And so after having lost his mum when he was a 5-year-old, he's come back to witness his other mother, Warripi, being beaten up and dying. This is a constant. This is an ongoing thing. I helped lift my auntie's body into a body bag earlier this year in a town camp. Like, it's, for my family, there's a death every month, you can guarantee.
Jacinta, when you say the system needs a shake-up, what does it look like? What do you want it to look like?
It looks like a better child protection system where it's obviously got to be much better funded. There's got to be enough people on the ground. You know, we do need to get more foster families because of the rates of kids that are being taken away. You know, if they're Aboriginal foster families, that's a bonus, that's wonderful. But we need good foster families, because not always foster families aren't always good either. But the system, they need to be able to investigate circumstances and take children away before things happen to them. When they're first reported, a thorough investigation needs to happen. Quite often this doesn't happen, and quite often there's a reluctance to take Aboriginal kids because of the fears that we're talking about, the idea of another stolen generation.
Is that resistance within the community, or is that resistance from foster families?
No, from the system itself to actually remove children. And, you know, in my family, like, we've fought for kids to be removed, given to families, and be they white families or whatever, but we've fought for them to be removed. And in some cases it's been too late. You know, they haven't been removed in time, and then, you know, you've got to deal with this child who's got trauma in their lives, which affects them for the rest of their life.
Sarain, as you're listening to this, and I know you're a visitor to the country, and there are a lot of similarities, what would an ideal situation look like to you, where specifically talking about families and kids being taken out of homes, is there some ideal version of that you think could work moving forward, that involves the community, that does protect safety as well?
The best foster parent in the world is the land. And so I think that we need to figure out ways to put kids back on the land. And I don't think that foster homes are necessarily the answer. I think that we need to decolonize the system, decolonize the way that we're looking at it. We're trying to fix a system in a colonial way that will never work for an Indigenous person. That's from my perspective. You know, grandmothers have been raising our children for many, many generations now. So, you know, how can we figure out how to make this kind of multiple family units work? How can we have systems that go right into the community? Maybe, you know, I don't want to say, I think the whole idea of like a boarding school is really scary for us, but what could it look like if we designed it? What if we had a place where we could have recovery for families? My mom is a therapist and has been working, she was the head of Catholic Children's Aid before Children's Aid became Children's Aid in Toronto in the 70s. And the thing that she has worked hard on during her entire career is reuniting families, especially families who have had problems with sexual abuse. Because what we know is the #1 effect of sexual abuse is sexual abuse. Well, where were Indigenous people abused? They were abused in mission schools. So this whole system, the whole thing that's happening in our communities is a result of colonization and of these schools and of the way we've been treated. So how do we heal together? Like, it's easy to see all of the problems, but we need to go in and we need to say, look, you were sexually abused and you're abusing your children, so let's figure out a way to heal. Let's figure out a way to fix the hurt, fix the pain, and stop removing people. We're separating our families. Let's get back to who we really were, and let's figure out how that looks today.
I just want to...
No,
I was going to go to you anyway.
I agree, because I feel like sometimes you got to address the problem at home and find ways to do that. You know, I've been to communities where all they have resource-wise are things that just feed that, in a sense. It feeds aggression and addiction and all the poisons that kind of lead to have these problems where you can't be fit enough to look after a child, so then people do think that they need to be taken and stuff. So I feel like sometimes you need to address those problems. And you said, by what would it look like if they created it or created the system themselves, etc. Why not with a community? Why not let them choose what they want? And there are communities where people are community leaders are trying to do that, but it's still so overrun by, there's only an ATM, a Woolworths, and a pokey pub. It's like, how come there isn't at least like a bowling alley or, just the simple things, I think.
Right now, Hunter, with your TV show, you are arguably the most high-profile Indigenous actor on TV, literally right now. Don't tell Rob Collins I said that.
We got Deborah Malman, come on.
But does that come with responsibility for you?
Miranda Tapsell, not to put you down.
I said right now. Love Child's not on right now.
Come on, feminism.
We got some great
there's women out there.
Okay, fine then. I said actor. She's an actress. It's fine. It still works.
Rob Collins, still Millswell.
That one, Marc.
Is there responsibility that comes with that for you?
Definitely. You're a role model, and that's another thing that I feel like we need a lot more of as well. We need a lot more role models. So there's a big thing in our communities where a lot of these children are ashamed and don't feel like they're capable of being at least who they are, I guess. And these opportunities, where you do have Deborah Malmans and the Miranda Tapsells and shows like Cleverman and Redfern Now and etc. It gives these kids a role model to look up to, and it's a huge responsibility to kind of take on, but it's also a responsibility that we all need to really take on as a community, in the arts, in politics, and it's something that I think about every single day, really. And there was a young boy as well, and it's not even just for the Indigenous community. There was a young boy, full stop, that he was just an Australian boy that was looking up to it because he was seeing something that he wanted to be interested in as well. And I was speaking to someone from London as well, who took the time out of his. He knew when he was in school or in high school, he knew that he wasn't being taught what was happening in Australia through the link of his country, and he was taught a certain way. And so he specifically went out and looked at the actual history and was more intrigued by that. As
a result of watching Cleverman, are you saying?
Yeah.
Amazing.
Have you encountered racism since you've done the TV show?
You get it subtextually more than in your face.
What does that look like?
It's not so much racism. Like you get your normal banter racism, but that's just I don't see racism as something as someone is actually trying to be racist. It's just they're unsure of either of themselves or of what they're trying to banter about, I guess. And it's knowledge. It's a class thing at the end of the day. It's a jealousy thing at the end of the day. It's a whole other spectrum than what it actually is on the surface. But so most of the things that you'll get is just people not spending the time to invest. They'll watch one episode and feel that confronted where they'll say, this just isn't for me, and they'll apologize. They'll say sorry. So it's like, sorry, this just isn't for me.
Sorry, your history is too confronting.
Yeah. So it's like, why are you apologizing?
Bad.
Yeah.
I tried.
How about when you were doing the campaign, Geoffrey? What did you encounter any racism?
Not so much. Oh, yes. Well, so I was running in. Well, the boundaries of the seat I was running for pretty much include the richest and poorest, straightest, gayest, most diverse community I think the country has. And so, no, not on the street. Where it did occur, and I don't read it, is the comments on articles or whatever. My mother reads it. I don't know why she reads it.
Your mother reads the comments. You need to tell her to stop doing that. It's a terrible thing to do.
She reads the comments and she'll call me and she's like, "What does that four-letter word mean?" And people are horrible, but that's
life.
It's unfortunate.
What's your approach to it? Like, are you just like a block it or don't read it, or do you engage?
people who write those things have an opinion that you're not going to change. And if you're involved in the business of persuasion, you focus your attention on the people who may come with you. So reading a comment from somebody who's describing you in a particular way that's clearly against you is not productive use of your time. So I don't read those comments. I don't mind having a challenging conversation. I mean, there were policies in the election, and no doubt we'll come to some of them at some point, that I struggled with and were difficult, and the community I was trying to represent were acutely affected by them. Whether that was the tax on superannuation, which a bunch of the rich residents were very upset about, or it was the marriage equality issue, which of course, you know, seat of Sydney has Oxford Street, Darlinghurst and Surrey Hills in it. They're difficult conversations, but what was the most remarkable thing in the election was people will come up to you, Redfern's train station, 6 o'clock on a Friday morning, and they just wanted to talk about it. I was really impressed with both the intelligence and the genuine respect that opponents would show to me on the street. I know other political candidates didn't necessarily experience that, but I was really impressed by the community.
Did you ever feel like you were pre-selected as a token in a heavily left seat?
God, no. I worked so fucking hard to get pre-selected in that seat. Those sorts of comments really shit me. Because politics isn't easy, and particularly in the party I've chosen, it's not an easy slog. They're currently sitting in a room in Sydney trying to decide how they're going to pre-select candidates in the future, and there's 5,000 or 6,000 people avidly fighting it out. It's not a straightforward process. It takes many years, many relationships, lots of hard work, all the while trying to be a university student and a graduate lawyer and then now an owner of a law firm. It was hard work, and there were other good candidates who wanted it. So it was a hard slog. Believe it or not, a lot of people want to be candidates for the Liberal Party. I don't know what's wrong with them, but we constantly fight ourselves for the least wanted position in the world, I think. So no is the short answer.
Laura, a little while ago, you were nominated for a Logie Award. Give her a cheer for that, by the way. Woo! But
We didn't win though.
you wrote a piece about standing in the middle of the Logie's red carpet, feeling like you didn't belong. Can you tell me what that experience was like for you?
I suppose that piece was kind of hard to explain the narrative of it, but I suppose the reasoning behind it was growing up, I think Aboriginal people are told that we are given a lot of things, these magical things that I don't know what they are. I've been told that I have free university, which I never got. I've been asked whether I get all these scholarships, all these different things, and it's just not true.
Wish.
So we're constantly kind of fed this narrative that Aboriginal people are given things by the likes of Andrew Bolt, Pauline Hanson, etc. And then, you get to a situation where, you're in the media and you come to have a sense of self-doubt at every opportunity that you're given, whether you actually earn that or whether it is tokenism, whether it is someone wanting an Aboriginal person in that position, whether they want, to show that they are being diverse and inclusive and, are allies of the Aboriginal community. And actually through the process of doing Young and Black, the documentary, and I asked this question to everyone, all of the young people that we spoke to about, when you're given an opportunity, it's my own personal therapy, when you're given an opportunity, do you question that? Do you have that idea that it is tokenism? And the responses that I got were, yes, obviously, but screw that. I think Nakia Louis' response actually was, do you think that the Andrew Bolts of the world, when they're given an opportunity, go, oh, I don't deserve this opportunity. Like, I, shouldn't be this media commentator. No, they take it and run with it, and they use their voice. And I think us as Indigenous people have a responsibility to take every opportunity that we get and run with it.
Sarain, have you had that moment of questioning whether you belong?
Questioning.
That moment she was describing there of questioning whether you belong because somebody wanted you there as a token.
All the time. It's like a daily.
30 minutes
And I think
break.
like half of my media events,
Take 10
I'm like
minutes
literally
break,
always
Crystal.
doing this like gambling game where I'm like, okay, if I do this, I'm going to be able to stand in front of this many people and I'm going to be able to reach this kind of thing. And okay, but this whole thing is run by this kind of resource extraction thing, and so it'll be this kind of money, and there's that aspect. Then the other part is like when Rise premiered at Sundance, I was supposed to just go and play nice, and Rise is about Indigenous resistance and resilience, and so here we are at Sundance, and we found out that one of the main lounges was sponsored by Chase Lounge. Well, it was Chase Bank. Well, Chase is one of the largest sponsors of the the Dakota Access Pipeline, and so, well, what are we going to do? Well, we're going to bring 20 activists in to watch this film. Are we going to have them watch the film and go around and smooze and drink free liquor and have free little snacks and get swag bags and then play nice? No. We're going to go to the Chase Lounge and we're going to occupy. And so if I'm never invited back to Sundance, well, so be it. What a loss for them.
Jacinta, as somebody that isn't necessarily working in that space, when you hear stories like that, do you think it's helpful? Do you think it actually helps Indigenous people when stuff like that happens?
I think, we need all kinds to move forward and to bring about, discussion and pull issues into the spotlight. Absolutely. I think, Sarain has her place, most definitely. I guess we wouldn't... Without that sort of, how do I put it? Yeah, without that sort of turbulence, you can't grow, you can't move forward. So, yeah, why not?
I think Aboriginal people are acutely good at doing something which Australians are particularly bad for, which is we pull each other down. And we're very, very terrible at celebrating success, generally as Australians, but more so in the Indigenous community. I was recently at an awards ceremony with a good friend of mine who's a director, and we walked in and she said, they always invite an Indigenous woman every year to these awards. It's so tokenistic. And she wouldn't walk the red carpet and all these things. And I was like, anyway, we're sitting down to dinner. I'm like, have you got a speech? Because you're up for this prize. She's like, there's no way I'm getting it. It's tokenism. Of course she got it. And she just turns to me and she's like,
but even when you win though, even when I've had times where I've caught myself even where you're sitting at home and you'll see an Aboriginal person win an award or etc. And then you even think then, they're only winning because they need to fill in those gaps. And then at the end of the day, it's like you're your own worst enemy. But
it's also up to us because, for example, politics is a classic place where it's a business of pulling people down as much as it is pulling yourself up. One of the most impressive things I've seen in the last few years is the way that the Indigenous politicians work together. From different parties, obviously have points to score, and they do, and so they should. But the way you see Ken and Linda and Mullendeary and so on get together and just talk about issues and come to common agreement is extremely impressive. It's rare, but it shows a blueprint for how we can be better at this moving forward.
I promised we'd talk about dating. Very soon we're going to have questions, so get thinking about what sort of questions you want to ask. But a couple of years ago, Sarain, and she knows where this is going, Sarain was in an article called Dating Native, where she said that she wanted to remain dating native. Firstly, Sarain, how's that working out for you?
My girlfriend just walked in. She's right there.
Hey!
She's non-Indigenous. So,
by the way, I'm glad you made it here. There's been a bit of a trip for her to get into the country.
All right. So, oh man.
Okay, let's start with this. Why was that important to you? Why was it important to you at the time?
Okay, so here's the deal. I was raised by a powerhouse activist mom who really made it known to me that it was important for me to think about the future. It's important to me. We have a saying back home where every single decision you make, you got to think 7 generations back. What would your ancestors think? And 7 generations forward, what is that going to look like?
Ooh, that's a lot of pressure.
Oh, yeah. But here's when it gets really complicated. The reason why I think that your treaty rights are so dangerous is because we have something in Canada called the Indian Act. The Indian Act makes who you are as an Indigenous person based on your bloodlines. That means unless you are 50% Native or more on paper, you do not have the rights of what the treaty was signed to grant you, which means if you don't have the card, you can't go hunting and fishing, even if your families had gone hunting and fishing there for thousands of years. You can't live in your community. You can't get access to any of the wonderful free stuff we get. it's not free gas and stuff. Yeah, so I think the complicated thing around dating Native is also around this conversation of lineage preservation and what blood quantum has done to our communities. You know, I mean, if you think the only way your kid's going to have treaty rights is if you go and have a child with another Indigenous person, well, then that's a really, really important thing. But then this thing called love gets in the way.
So you were talking about if you do move on to having kids, you wanted to adopt Indigenous kids. Was that your solution?
Yeah, I want to adopt Indigenous kids, and I also it's like a constant I also want to have my own children, and I'm just gonna out us. So Tara and I always have this conversation about, wow, it's really a little bit less complicated because I'm with a woman, but we talk about what does it look like. In one way, even though I'm not dating Native, I still have this weird, complicated thing where I'm I could still have a almost full-blooded Indigenous kid. I just get a donor.
Mate, you've made this work for you.
Designer baby.
You've really thought this through.
But I also want to have a child that belongs to Tara also. So that means that I'm going to most definitely have a mixed baby.
Mate, we're going to have a conversation with Vice because I feel like there's a spin-off show just in that alone. Hunter, firstly...
so complicated.
Hunter, firstly, congratulations because you're about to get married soon, yeah? Woo!
She's too good for him as well.
She white. Did you have a conversation? Has this ever played into your mind about the date,
No.
the race that you date, ever?
No, see, no. I've always been brought up to love before you judge, and so I've. In this day and age, really, in 2017, everyone on this globe isn't of one race. It's nearly impossible to be of just one singular race just through blood, and so I just see it as I don't see the colour, and I feel like if there's more of that, well then it's just acceptance, I guess.
Geoffery, does race come up with you when you're dating? Have
You
had awkward conversations with people?
Let's keep it above board.
PG.
By the way, Geoffery is the world's biggest flirt. He has flirted with everyone on the stage.
Even me.
Oh no.
Well, I always had an expression which was, I love my culture, I don't sleep with it. But
Oh, can somebody please tweet that now?
Then
Oh
I-
my God.
Channel 7 lifestyle.
Hey, you are just
Breaking
a machine.
news.
But then I saw
are planning
Hunter
to run
dancing
again
last night
sometime,
to Time, and maybe I'm revising my position. No, the only time it comes up... The only time it comes up, and I'm never meant to talk about this when there are cameras recording, but I'll do it anyway, is on Grindr. It does come up on Grindr a lot.
Yeah? How does that conversation go?
In two ways. One, because you can select to disclose what your race is, which I don't, but if I did, I guess it would be a complicated discussion.
Is there an option for Indigenous?
No, I don't think there is.
Racist.
Never options
Racist
for
gap.
Indigenous.
How dare they?
The really good
Asia
one is when
Pacific.
guys will be like, oh, so where are you from? And it's if anybody else is on Grindr in the room, they'll know that's a randomly common question on Grindr for some reason. And I'll respond, Australia. And they'll go, oh, really? Well, where are your parents from? They're from here too. Well, you look Spanish. And if I'm in a shit-staring kind of mood, I'll take them on it.
Yeah.
And we'll have a bit of a discussion. Whereas sometimes I'm like, yeah, I'm fucking Spanish. Are we doing this or what?
Yeah. I'm a big fan with I'm a big fan with cab drivers. Where are you from? I'm from fucking Marrickville. Take me home.
But how it does play into it is interesting. I've not long been I was in a long-term relationship, and I'd never thought it was a big issue for me, the Indigenous issue. But one of the things that made this guy so attractive to me when I first met him was that I mentioned, it came up in discussion, my Aboriginality and an organisation I work with. And his reaction was, oh, I know this organisation super well, like, oh, they're really great, the work they do. And all of a sudden, somebody who got it was really attractive. That was a super attractive quality I'd never thought about.
Laura, when does race come into play for you when you were considering people to date?
I don't think it's one of those things. Me and my sisters have had that discussion where, you know, my sister was dating an Indigenous man a few years ago, and we're all like, "That's good." It's
She's taken one for the
A+,
team. It's
A+.
fine.
But that's a creepy thing to think about. You know, it is like you can't take that
Make
into
sure you're not
account
family.
too much. You know,
They're a
but
close-knit family.
I do agree with Geoffery in that, like, it does help with someone who is on board with your community, or at least takes active interest, who cares about Indigenous issues, who is politically and socially engaged with things that Indigenous people would be engaged with. Otherwise, what the fuck do you talk about?
Because you're going to snap the biscuit at some point. You're going to come home and be like, that fucker today, blah, 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 blah. And you want them to get why you're frustrated.
See, but sometimes I feel like it helps as well because it's an opportunity to think on the other side of the spectrum as well. And I think that's that's important as well. I had a time where my cousin, I didn't even know how a young brain could even think like this, but I introduced her to my fiance, and she's like, "Why are you dating a white girl?" And it's just like, wow, how does she see that? And so and then that I would only see that side of the spectrum by being with that, and yeah.
Jacinta, you were telling a beautiful story about your parents earlier, but when it comes to you for partners...
Well, my parents brought me up to consider myself as a citizen of the world. So, you know, I was always like, wow, how can I mix this up even further? You know, my
find an atlas and I will sleep with that one.
Spin the globe. No. So, yeah, my children's dad is half Mauritian, and you know, got the whole mix. But now my partner of nearly 7 years is a mad Scotsman, and he's always like, we are bloody colonised 200 years before you lot, you know. We have really interesting conversations, and you know, I'm like Geoffery over here. I'm a bit more of a conservative, and he's a total socialist.
That is the only time anyone's gone, I see Geoffery and I will out-conservative him.
But yeah, so you know, my kids, actually my 18-year-old, I've got an 18-year-old, believe it or not. Yeah, I don't know how I got on.
He's almost old enough to marry Hunter.
That's right. But he's like going, oh, I've had a bad experience with a Greek girl. I'm not going there again, and I'm not going to go near
because they're
Māori
all
girls.
the same.
I've had a bad experience with them. I'm like, all right, okay, well, you know, don't sell yourself too short, son. Where do you think you're going to end up one day, you know? But, you know, I'm like, that'll be interesting to see. I've got 4 sons, so it'll be interesting to see what kind of girls or fellas they bring home. Yeah.
All right. If you have questions, something great is about to come towards you. This is called a catch box. Believe it or not, it's a microphone, and you talk into that thing there. Who has a question and wants the fluffy things thrown at them? Great, down front. There you go. Aha! On the full too. Well done.
Just a question for Geoffery. As a penultimate law student, what is the best pathway to gain some experience into native title? And what did your journey look like from graduation to where you are now?
You come and work for my law firm, for starters. So when I'm not being an unsuccessful Liberal candidate for the seat of Sydney, I'm a director of
not unsuccessful. You came in second.
And I should say the
Second's
current
the
member is an
best.
excellent member of Parliament, so it was quite an honour, and she was lovely during the campaign. It's tenure plibiscite. But to answer your question, because of the nature of that field, volunteer, land councils, or even some of the big firms, surprisingly, so Freehills and Allens, for example, have native title practices, if that's sort of what you're interested in. But the best way would be find the Aboriginal Land Council in your area, call them up. They are never going to refuse a penultimate year law student an internship position.
Awesome. Who else has a question?
All right.
Jesus.
Don't hit the cameras.
I may be shit at this. Sorry. Should have warned you.
Hello, I'm from Rockhampton, and I work for Queensland Health, and I head out to Woorabinda a fair bit. My question is, this is not the audience we have at Woorabinda. How do I get some of the hope that you guys have, and I must say excellent speakers, and I love every point you made, how do I get some of that hope to those kids who sit in I work in oral health, so I sit there and I tell them what not to do for their teeth, and they sit and they eat toffee apples in front of me, because they made them the night before. They know it all, but they don't want to do it. How do we get some of the hope that you guys have to them? Apart from Hunter's show, which Cleverman probably gets into their television sets and into them.
Need a whole dental health subplot, season 3. Make that shit happen.
Yes!
Eat your vegetables.
My job is done.
Well,
My special superpower is brushing my teeth.
I actually, apart from used to be involved in a children's TV program called Yamba's Playtime, I now work with Yamba the honey ant, and we visit remote communities with all kinds of different health messages, and I find what we do is quite successful. So if you want to give me a call sometime. You have to do it in a fun, interactive way with a lot of repetition and probably music, kids' songs. If you've got an early childhood audience, that's sort of my area of expertise. But that's a good way of doing it. And if you can find some people that these kids look up to help drive that message home, that's always really good.
That's the point. I think the example thing can't be stressed enough. Recently, Laura and I had the honour of travelling to Walgett together, where my father's from, and it's a tough town, and I hadn't been back for a very long time. And what hit me when we left was that it's entirely incumbent upon me and my sister, who's doing a PhD, and my brother, to get back into our towns and to talk to what are invariably mostly our relatives anyway, but to those communities to model success. Because if you see it happening in your family, let alone your school, in your community, it becomes possible. And the biggest issue facing most young Aboriginal people is putting success as a possibility in their future. And it's incumbent upon us to get out there and do it. So maybe if you can find some people who are from that community who have done well, sadly probably got out and done well, but if you can get them back.
Just to really add to that, just because you mentioned it's about sugar and candy and all that stuff,
yeah.
I'm so guilty. But, we have rampant diabetes back home, and one of the things that we're suffering from is the idea that we survived on ration food, flour, water, sugar, and that really, really messed us up as Indigenous people because our bodies just, quite frankly, can't process it. So why not talk about food sovereignty? Let's bring healthy food back to the community and actually get it in the ground. I think the best way to change it is to give capacity back to these kids, give them something they can be proud of, that they can take care of, and maybe that's just a garden.
I was going to say the same thing, but she did it better.
Hunter said it first.
All right.
What she said.
There's a dude up the back. Watch me fuck this up.
You're
I only
fired
nearly
from,
knocked out a guy that works for SBS. It's fine.
you're fired from Cube.
I feel like that was very violent.
I think less force next
Sorry,
time.
Chris. We're good.
That was,
It's going to take my show off the air.
well done. I guess I wanted to come to the concept of allies. Now, I know, I think two people had mentioned it briefly. I think Sarain, you had, and Laura, maybe yourself too. I sat in on a talk by Alicia Garza at the Festival of Dangerous Ideas at the Opera House last year, and she mentioned the topic of an ally wasn't the most important. It was just the need to get the knowledge out there and to bring people along. But the idea of the word ally was somewhat divisive. But if we can entertain that idea for just a little bit, what do you see as, who would your ideal ally be, or how can literally I, be the ally that you need, or what can I do? What types of things can I do to be the difference or be the change? Thank you.
Hold on, wait, before you start, just 1 second. Hold on, I'm going to show you how. Can I have your mic?
All right, here we go.
Yeah.
I'm just worried about this
Please
thing.
don't fall off the stage. Oh.
See, I don't feel so bad now. That's fine.
That's how you be an ally.
I would say I get a lot of questions from people, at the pub, or, you start talking about Indigenous issues, and for them it's the first time that they've entered into a discussion like that. They want to actually be more informed, to show that they care about, Indigenous issues in society, but they don't know how. First floor is coming in to Aboriginal people and expecting them to have all the answers and to educate you as if they are the Indigenous sensei to the problems that face society. Like, what can I do to make Indigenous people better? Like, I just go and learn about some of the specifics of some of the issues that you care about, and don't ask ignorant questions at the very top. Go and make an effort to educate yourself. Don't expect Indigenous people to answer that for you at the start.
And also, with what you said before as well, it takes two to tango too. We also got to want an ally as well, and there's a lot of Aboriginal people in this country that don't, which kind of feeds the problem as well. So, I think it's a struggle on both sides of the party.
Jacinta, I want to hear from you. What does an ideal ally look like to you?
more and more Aboriginal people getting along better
Yeah.
with one another.
Yeah.
That's what allies look like to me. I think, generally non-Indigenous people in Australia really want the best for Aboriginal people and will bend over backwards to try and be that. And I think, if you live and work amongst Aboriginal people, you've just got to be the best person you are, because you're contributing in the best way you can in your capacity. And that's what's really important, and understanding, because it's a cultural exchange that's got to go on. There's a lot of Aboriginal people that still need to learn a lot more about other parts of the world and people from different backgrounds, and it's just
And our
that
own
sharing,
culture as
and
well.
our own culture too. But it's understanding. It's just understanding, and that comes through dialogue that comes through engaging with different people, that comes through education, all those sorts of things. I would certainly love to see more Aboriginal people get along with each other, because I'm very outspoken about the things that I talk about, because I just cut to the chase and talk about this is the reality of what's going on. I get called a lot of names like sellout, coconut, Jackie. Honestly, that shit does not bother me, because I don't care. What other people think of me is none of my business, as long as I'm getting out there the messages that I need to get out, and I'm basically speaking from my lived experience, through my truths that I know. And I think it's important that we all share the truth from ourselves with one
Jacinta,
another.
do you feel like you've been the best ally to other Aboriginal people, though? Because you have been quite aggressive in your messages to people that I know. Do you feel like you're always being that supportive figure that you want?
I'd like to know an example, actually, and then I can speak to that example.
The Voller family in the Northern Territory.
The Voller family in the Northern Territory?
Yes.
Okay, so we're talking about the Voller family. Well, that's a situation where, actually, no, I haven't. They've been rather aggressive toward me and made quite some threats towards me. I know NITV did put out a post, some articles saying that I was wanting to have it lit, which was a typo with Kira Voller, when it was meant to say, let's have it out, because the Warrapiri way, she's married to my nephew. If you've got an issue, then you speak publicly to one another. That's the Warrapiri way of doing things. You talk it out, and I have welcomed that many times with the Voller family. Let's catch up. Let's talk face to face, because I'm a strong believer, and I've done this with people a lot online. We've gone at one another, through debate, and people have attacked me through debate, and I'm happy to sit there and listen to what they perceive I've said. And I'm happy to sit down and go, well, actually, this is what I meant by that. Until you really understand what it is I'm trying to say, you're just listening, you're just hearing trigger words, and that's setting you off. So let's have a conversation and turn things around. It's a simple process, but you've got to be open to doing that. And I'm absolutely open to doing that with the Voller family. I've known Dylan since he was a little kid. He was in my household. And there are very sensitive issues that I try to discuss with his sister, and she decided to make it a whole public display because she,
Let's move on if we can.
I guess, isn't at that point yet where she's prepared to sit down, have a conversation, and work it out as human beings, as two women. And
All right, who else has a question? Let's go to the front. That's my co-host there being like, I don't want to get hit in the head with that fucking...
Hi guys, my name's Patrick. Thanks very much for having this candid conversation with us today. My question was to speak to you, Laura, about an issue that you brought up earlier about the accessibility of the law, which, Geoffery, it sounds like for you is a really powerful mechanism for instance, claiming land titles. It sounded like you agreed with what Laura was saying, which is that it can be a difficult area to understand and you need professional assistance. And I was just wondering whether both of you could speak more on how that situation could be ameliorated.
Law is one of those terrible things where...
Drop the mic.
Because it's obviously the most powerful device we have at our hands as citizens, but it's a terribly exclusive thing. Lawyers deliberately create a profession and an environment where you're on the inside. So us lawyers, we talk a language, we conduct ourselves in a particular way. And when you're in the tent, it's great. And when you're out of the tent, it's terrible. This is one of the rare instances you'll probably catch me being highly critical about some of the conservative governments in this country, and that's we don't put nearly enough money into legal aid. We don't put nearly enough money into the Aboriginal legal services. It was
Are you sure you're in the right party?
Well, there were 3 Labor governments before that didn't increase the budget either, so I don't think it's a matter of which party, it's a matter of us agreeing as a country it's a priority.
Let's make the last one.
We're not going to change the accessibility of law overnight, but the one thing we can change is the way that we support people to access law, and this is one of the areas where I actually think spending more money is a start. To be a legal aid lawyer, for example, is a terribly difficult life because it's very poorly paid, and we don't provide enough support to those lawyers who choose to do that, who are often some of the most exceptional legal minds but most compassionate individuals, and we should put more support behind them as a country.
And some of that is really straightforward. Like, there's a service at the Aboriginal Legal Service Office in New South Wales and ACT called the Custody Notification Service, which means that whenever an Aboriginal person is arrested, they have access to a lawyer who checks on their well-being and safety. And, you know, it is credited with helping reduce Aboriginal deaths in custody. But it fought year after year after year for funding on both sides of government. It's now federally funded after massive campaigns. They went through GoFundMe campaigns online to keep going, to have those 2 lawyers who are on the clock 24 hours. And that is just either negligence by the government, it's a federally funded program. I don't know what else to call it. It's just something that has proven results that was just left by the wayside, and now it has actually been funded finally.
Another thing which is very simple and very practical that we're starting to do as a country, but we're not quite there, and it's a state and territory issue, is both educating the judiciary in a culturally sensitive way, but also the police force. I was on a plane coming back from Cairns 2 weeks ago, and there was a graffiti incident in the bathroom, and there were 2 young Aboriginal boys on the plane, and we all know how the story ends. Of course, we land at Sydney Airport, 4 cops come up, rip those 2 kids off. I was sitting next to Professor Megan Davis of law. We both went up to the police in the terminal then and asked, can we speak to the boys? They're minors, they clearly don't have a custodian with them right now, and they don't have a lawyer. And the way the police officer reacted to us was frightening. There were 7 fully grown men standing around 2 young guys, and Megan and I, who can bring our law game, were petrified. If we have a sensitive and smart police force, we'll solve a lot of the problems we currently face, because discretion is a huge issue, and I don't think it's exercised particularly sophisticatedly right now.
Just to add to that, I don't know if you have this here, but in Canada we're working with Aboriginal Legal Services, it's still called that there, and we have restorative justice programs happening. So what we're saying is that we actually want to have the ability to not send our kids, not send our adults, not send our Indigenous people to jail, because it doesn't work. The jail system is a flawed system, and we have the highest incarceration rates across North America. And, you know, which is so funny, you guys know the show Orange is the New Black? Yeah. There is every single race represented in that show. We're talking about a prison show. We are the highest incarcerated numbers. There's no Indigenous representation on that show. What is up? No.
And you're 15 times more likely to end up in an Australian jail if you're Indigenous.
Same.
Last question. Who wants it? And Jan's going to pass you because it's been mutually decided that I don't know how to fucking throw.
Hi. I have a kind of a broad question. I've been lucky enough to work with a lot of Indigenous artists and putting Aboriginal stories out there, but I still feel like there's a huge lack in the actual true Aboriginal story being brought to light. What do you think is the best way of trying to get it out there? Like, I've worked with companies that, you know, are the leading force in Australia to bring forward Aboriginal stories, but it still is a major lacking, you know, just getting the story out there.
Well, it's changes in our education system. You know, even when I'm going through school, you know, I only been out of school 10 years now. Like, I had history lessons where the history teacher did not care about Aboriginal history, it felt. Like, it was a mandatory subject that you had to get through. And he didn't engage the kids in a way that they cared. And also, he would turn to me in the middle of class and say, Laura, is that right? And it's, I'm 15, 14 at this time.
Just out of curiosity, was he right?
No.
See?
But
he went to the source.
But the real issue is, and I kind of see this in some of the stories that I've done, that we're finding out about some of this history now because it's not been documented properly. Some of the missions, the abuse that happened on missions and reserves, and the actual injustices that have happened in this country are known by the Aboriginal people, but they haven't been documented, and there's been deliberate campaigns to get rid of some of that documentation. So, you know, you talk about our history, and a lot of people agree that there was kind of modern day slavery happening in Australia with unpaid wages, like going up until the 1970s. That's just not a fact that people know. And that starts in our education system, teaching kids about some of those realities and teaching in a way that they really will care, bringing in elders from the community to talk about how the stolen generation impacted them in a personal way. That is how you start.
And another part to that, and I think it picks up on exactly what Laura's saying, but this is a positive thing. I've said it already today, I don't think we celebrate our successes as a country. One thing we've done really well, but nobody knows about it, is this organisation called the Australian Institute of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies in Canberra. It's a government body, $60-odd million of your taxpayer money goes to it each year. I've got to be positive about it because I'm currently the
Disclosure,
chairman.
he works for
I'm
it.
the chairman of the board. But it holds the largest contextualised Indigenous collection in the world. It's UNESCO World Heritage listed. Whether it's language, cultural, documentary evidence of next to almost every language group in this country, it's held there in vaults with the National Archives. Now, it's excellent we've preserved it, but the next thing we've got to do, and this is where we're starting to have a conversation with government about, we've got to get it out there. I hadn't seen most of these. There's a letter sitting in a drawer in this archive. It's remarkable. It's a handwritten letter from Bundjalung to the governor dated 1789. And you go down there, it's sitting there in a drawer. It's the most remarkable historical artefact, and 17 or 18 Australians have seen it. I think that's stupid. This wouldn't happen in most other countries. We should be celebrating our history and getting it out there. So the first step's doing that. And the opportunity that I think that's about to present itself to us is the 250th anniversary of Cook's arrival. And I was really impressed this week to have a meeting with Dr. Brendan Nelson from the War Memorial and representatives from the Prime Minister's Department. They want to sit down and find a way to to acknowledge the Frontier Wars for the first time.
That's a big move.
And this is from an organisation that has resisted it. And all it took was us being willing to say, okay, maybe we won't have the national monument for that in the War Memorial. Where will we put it? Well, maybe we put it in the Parliamentary Plaza. So it sits between the War Memorial and Parliament. We have a standalone, massive national monument.
FYI, Frontier Wars.
But isn't it already
the wars
there?
that occurred?
Isn't it already there? Isn't it the occupation happening in the front line of Parliament?
Well, I guess, no, the occupation in the front line of Parliament doesn't acknowledge the genocide that took place during the settling movements. And that's what a lot of people are pushing for.
So I just wanted to just get back to this idea of allyship, because I think what you're saying, we've been thinking about this a lot in North America, and I think we're getting to a place right now where we're actually seeing more Indigenous content made by Indigenous people across the world for the first time. You know, my show is on a mainstream channel, and it's like amazing to me the idea that there are Native people being shot by tear gas and experiencing crazy brutality, but it's on a mainstream channel and people are seeing it. And that's what happened in the civil rights era, was that for the very first time, whether they knew it or not, when the Watts riots were happening, it was being broadcasted into mainstream televisions. And so for the first time, people were seeing the injustice. And I think that's important. That's what's happening with us right now. But the other side of that is, how do you be an ally? Well, if you work for the media, if you're an artist, if you've got a really big following, if you know someone with a big following, that pass the mic thing was, let's not have a conversation where it's like, how can I support you and then tell your story? The conversation is, how do I stand behind you with my hand out like this while you tell your story and make sure that you don't fall back? How do I stop talking and let you be the one with the voice? Because the narrative for so long has been, I'm going to help you tell your story. Well, that's bullshit. Let us tell our own stories and support it. Like, really support it. That's allyship.
Ladies and gentlemen, will you please give your hands together for Laura, Geoffery, Sarain, Hunter and Jacinta. Have an awesome festival. Thank you so much for coming. Sarain's show starts on SBS VICELAND next Thursday. You should watch it. It's called Rise. Woo. See you guys.